Buckle your shoes tightly, friends, lest you stiffen to the core in fear. For I've a tale to tell thee, and in all the lore of Connor Prairie, you'll never hear a worse one. In these taverns, you'll often hear a yarn repeated and inflated with each telling until it defies belief. And so it was with the tall tale of old Sam Kelley. It was said that sometimes, on the far side of the pine forest, a wisp of smoke could be seen rising from his cave. The great soot-coated cave where dwelt that giant. Aye, a giant who'd stride through the forest on legs big as oaks, counting as he walked in a great shrill voice. And oft unguarded in his cave lay not one, not two, three, nor even four, but $500 cold hard cash. And if some foolhardy soul ventured, nay, trespassed upon his territory, he'd grab their legs quick as a wink and whip 'em straight. You heard me right. He'd whip 'em so as their whole body, from crown to corns, was straight and stiff as a board. Body seized up like a statue, save for the eyes, cutting and darting around. And once they was snapped straight, their lives were in the hands of old Sam Kelley. Now, he could store you in his workshop alongside other plank folk, paralyzed and awaiting your final day, knowing your body's on a hair trigger, and any small force would curl you in on yourself, just like those snap bracelets, the ones with the pink and green cheetah print you can get in the market stalls. If he fancied making an example of you, he could hurl you at a tree so's you'd snap around it quick as a bear trap. Or, if he was feeling famished, he might just mush you and eat you right then and there. Most commoners wouldn't dare risk life and limb. However, every town has a few souls whose greed outweighs their fear. And so we find ourselves following our travelers three. A pompous old rummy, a thief with a scar on one cheek and a prowess as long and thin as his scabbard.
All right, then.
And a fresh-faced boy, a mere 13 summers unwise.
Nearly 14.
Having picked-lipped the giant's trail and followed it deep into the pine wood, the three hole up around a fire for the night and rehash their scheme to rob the slumbering giant early in the morn.
I'm truly pleased that you've trapped this quail for us, but would you care for my serving? 'Tis a healthy portion and I'm tight as a tick.
All right, then. Hand it over.
Well, say, old-timer, you haven't had a bite of your fresh mealy share. Is anything queer with you, quail?
Oh, I'm just off in my head, thinking about me in town, boy.
We'll pull your head out of the clouds. We've got a job to do.
A big job then, that's for sure. I'm just a bit fearful is all. Oh, please tell me again what's not going to happen to me.
God damn it, boy. Where's your backbone?
Oi, give the lad a break. Every young'un needs a bit of stiffening up now and again. I remember my first coin snatch, and this'll be no more perilous.
So you say.
Anyway, I don't mind building you up in your breeches, boy. Say, let's have a tune. Play me in, thief.
All right, then. Let me dust off the old loot.
Oh, joy, yes. Give me a lolly, by which I won't forget.
Well, there's a giant named Sam Kelley in a cave beyond the pines, and if we three act cleverly, we're sure to rub him blind.
A giant?
That's right. But he'll never crush me into jam nor squish me into jelly. The birds will tell how we have run at old Sam Kelley. No, he'll never grab me by the legs and snap me round a tree. For I'm too swift and clever, Sam Kelley won't get me.
Nay, he'll never crack me like a whip and break me back and neck. We'll take the best and burn the rest, for he's a man of all respect.
But we don't know if he's evil.
How decent could he be? For Christ's sake, lad, he's 25'3".
Oh, he's never gonna wrap me round an older roller dash. I cannot wait to sneak and take $500 cash. No, he's never gonna wrap me round an older roller dash. I find him unattractive, his penis tastes like trash.
What?
Oh, that's it! Fuck him, yeah!
Oh, yes, it was most enjoyable.
What do you get with your share of the coin, old timer?
Well, I've had my eye on a young catamite. Well, it's about the same size inseam as that lad there. But he doesn't come cheap.
By his wounds, that puts the sin of thieving in the shade, doesn't it?
Right.
You're risking skin for a bit of cheek.
Well, your words, not mine. My coin, not thine.
Tell you what I'm gonna do. Me, sassy wench, the old sea hag.
Right.
She nags like a hoppy, and when she's not nagging, she's leaving the house to tend to the barley, she says.
Tell me about
So
it.
I'm gonna have the blacksmith make me a great big lock on me cellar door to keep that harlot home.
Oh, is that so?
That's right, lads. I'm locking her up for love. It's the thing that everyone says, but nobody does it.
Aye, and what of you, boy?
Well, I'll be the one to do what I'm gonna do. I'll go to the straight to the blacksmith, right? And he'll do me a lock on me bonus room, the wench. It's the thing that everyone says, but nobody does it.
And that's your own idea, is it?
Well, I just thought. I suppose it was rather silly.
As the travelers three shared their dreams of riches round the fire, the old man never suspected that his two compatriots had conspired against him. $500 doesn't split evenly three ways, and so the thief and the boy hatched a plan to poison the old man.
We'll bend the old shoe.
They'd concocted a powder of 3 parts paralyzing toad venom and 1 part herbal laxative. The venom would freeze him in his tracks and loosen his bowels, and when the giant ate the old fella, poison and all, it'd freeze him up just the same. And as everyone knows, just like shit to a shark, a giant can sniff out a loose mess from miles away and can't steer clear of it. Early the next morn, they peppered but just a pinch into his porridge, and before you know it, above the piney pass, in the dank stone cave, nostrils the size of dustbins flared and snuffled, waking to the tangy scent of shark sugar on the wind. Aroused to ravenous rage by the whiff of human feces on his property, old Sam Kelley bounded down the rock face towards the source, sending the stones all a-clatter with his passing. Meanwhile, the 2 turncoats hid behind a rotten log, 4 beady eyes keeping vigil, and 2 tall, fanciful caps rising in clear sight above, as the old man stood stock still, pouring like a faucet into his shoes. A growing rumble as great steps approached. A shadow fell across the old man's rigid form. Quick as a wink, down came the thumb like a truncheon from the heavens, mushing the old pederast into jelly. Sam Kelley was wild with hunger, and in no time he wolfed down the pasty melange of viscera and excreta. But just as he licked the last of the sweet gravy from his great paw, the poison did its work. He clotted, engorged, and stiffened up, blood red, unconscious and pulsing. He swayed for a moment like a great oak awaiting the woodsman's last hack. Then down he plummeted. The possums and pixies scuttled for cover as the giant slammed to the forest floor, shaking leaves from the trees and men from their boots for miles around. Autumn came early that year. Amidst the falling leaves, the 2 ninnies tried with all their might to give that giant a taste of his own medicine, to snap him round a tree trunk. But as the old saying goes, you can't wrap a giant round a tree with anything less than travelers 3.
Push! Come on, lad!
He's just too large. I can't budge him.
If you'd quit your whinging and put your working back into it, boy.
He's gonna wake up any moment.
And as the foolhardy adventurers bickered, a lid began to flicker, revealing an eye like a great bloodshot grapefruit. Then that great peeper flapped open, and oh, what sights it did peep! As the thief pushed and strained, his pant leg hiked up, revealing a scandalous expanse of hairless ankle flesh, beckoning, or rather demanding, a stern hand. Was obliged in a flash as Thwop grabbed the great leathery mitts round those brittle Victorian stems. The thief had time but for 2 words.
Run, boy!
The boy sprinted away as quick as his legs would carry him, looking back over his shoulder at a scene of terror, a sight best left unseen. With the ankles held firm, Sam Kelley raised his arms skyward, and the thief's body lashed upward through the morning air, the blood rushing to his head, his vision pinholing, his hat launched into the branches above. Then, just as his shaggy locks reached the apex, Sam Kelley whipped the legs downward, locking his ankle, knee, and hip joints into one fused unit. The sheer force of the shockwave shot from the small of his back through the nape of his neck, and his spine's natural S-curve snapped into a rigid capital I. Next, the thief knew his scolioid back and supple limbs were rifled straight into one brittle bone length, straight as a church nail. As the giant held the planked body, one hand round the ankles, his massive feet shoulder-width apart, he locked eyes with the fleeing boy and snarled, baring teeth like gravestones. Purple veins slithered up his neck, and without a second thought, he tossed the thief's rigid body over his shoulder, where it spun end over end, snapped up around a tree, and hung quivering like a gangplank. The dead face was frozen in an expression of terror.
He rugged him. He whipped him round that tree like a Persian broadloom. And now I've got to be the one to get out of here before I get the same treatment.
But the giant closed the gap with a mere 5 great strides. And the toddling teen was overtaken. And in less time than the telling, the wayward lad was whipped straight. And as he was lifted toward the heavens, the boy swooned away. When that merciful darkness parted, the lad found himself stowed beneath the giant's ponderous arm like a stick of kindling, bobbing with the giant's great strides up the mountainside. He thought to wriggle free, only to find he couldn't move his limbs, nor so much as wiggle a finger. He was well and truly snapped, and immobile as a post, save for his eyes. And those he darted round to beat the band, casting about for some clue as to his fortune. The forest floor reeled past in a blur, yards beneath him. The crunch of logs beneath enormous feet set a rhythm, matched by the heaving of great lungs, but otherwise all was eerie silence. Nary a caw or chirp, nor any sound of woodland life. It seemed all the birds had fled, and the lad wished he could have done the same. After a time, the passing forest floor was replaced by an enormous granite face, against which the giant's stout legs labored. 'Twasn't long until the lad, cutting his eyes forward, saw a cave pull into view like the maw of a great fish. As they neared the black opening, they passed a strange picket fence by its lip. An odd amenity, he thought. Just as it swept out of view, the lad realized each picket was a person, stiff as a plank. Then Sam Kelley stooped to pass the threshold, and as they entered the mouth of that craggy leviathan, all was plunged into darkness. And as the boy took in his surroundings, he noticed that all the planks of the floor, the slats of the walls, even the blades of the hand-spun ceiling fan, were rancorous plank folk. Old Sam Kelley had more planks in his cave than blades of grass on his lawn. To be frank, it was gaudy. The place was crowded with snapped men and women, all with eyes that quivered and darted, as if they were all the more restless for being the only mobile bits left. Then came the lad's realization that he himself was now among the ranks of the planked. His eyes swam in terror, even as he grudgingly admired the giant's craftsmanship. As the days passed, he started to notice the jobs of his fellows. Some of the plank folk were favored with more agreeable employment. Terence the Torch had an enormous 3-foot-tall fanciful hat of thick leather, soaked in lamp oil, and each evening he basked in its warmth as the giant read by its light. On the other hand, the giant was not afraid to let the rough end drag when needed. The chair legs threatened to snap under old Sam's prodigious bulk. Worse, Flathead Flynn the shovel was jammed face first into the dirt whenever old Sam needed to do a bit of post digging. But at least he got yard time. Worst of all was the lot of the pipe snake crew. Usually they lay segmented on the spool. That is, until one of his pipes was clogged by his thick jelly diet. Then they were cranked into the depths, plunged through wet masses of clumped hair and effluvia. Anything but the pipe snake crew, thought the boy. As he came to terms with his snapped fate, realizing he'd soon be assigned to some station, the boy hoped against hope to become a plank in the frame of Sam's reading glasses. Every night, the giant read by the warmth and light of Terry the Torch's flame, and the lad thought perhaps he could cut his eyes down and have a cheeky little read himself. He'd always wanted to become an avid reader, and now perhaps he'd finally find the time. But the best job of all, if only he weren't snapped, would be to serve in old Sam Kelley's menagerie of birds, a crew of humans costumed in plumage, with beaks affixed to their faces. Sam had always loved the many songs and merry colors of birds, but his thunderous footfalls had been scaring them away since he took his first steps, and he was heartbroken never to see nor hear them up close. So he devised replacements, little men dressed in feather garb. Every night they flapped and sang for the amusement of old Sam, and every day they sat eating the finest birdseed, huddled together in a cage fashioned of plank folk. Old Sam foraged the seed far and wide, and kept it in huge burlap sacks, one for each birdman, specially selected according to their tastes. Aye, for the birdmen were great favorites of old Sam Kelley. Above all, his prize fowl and the leading man in each night's performance, Peter LaFinch. But alas, the lad was snapped, and thus ineligible for the menagerie. In the end, he knew he'd do whatever old Sam had in store for him, whether he willed it or no. But as time passed, the boy remained stored in the corner, collecting cobwebs, little changed, save for the comings and goings of the giant. He began to notice the little things, like the way Sam distributed his weight carefully like a polar bear, never stepping down hard enough to snap the brittle plank folk underfoot. He also observed the giant's adoration for the birdmen, and watched as Sam carefully stroked and groomed their coats, adding fresh feathers to make sure their brilliant colors never faded. Sam Kelley was a creature of habit, and his routine went unchanged for so long that the boy lost all sense of time. That is, until one day, he noticed Sam working on a new project. He brought an enormous armload of planks out of the cave, and the sound of hammering rang in the air until late that night. The next morning, the giant was back at it, and worked all through the day and all through the night. The boy could only catch glimpses through the cave door, and wondered to himself what the giant might be building. An outhouse? A boat, perhaps? Then the hammering gave way to footsteps as the giant trudged inside. A darkness fell over the boy's corner as the barrel chest consumed his field of vision. The next he knew, the boy had been scooped up, along with his compatriots in the corner, an armload of cordwood for some unspeakable project. As he jostled and scraped against his peers, the lad realized it was the first time he'd been handled since his arrival. It was just lovely. As he felt himself hoisted and carried forth, a corona of blinding glare struck the boy's cave-dark dilated pupils, and for a time he only saw swimming blotches of pale color. As his eyes adjusted, an enormous dark mass came into focus, somehow even larger than the giant himself. 'Twas no boat, as the boy had first suspected, but a long, tapered hexagonal box, a masterpiece crafted from the bodies of 200 plank folk. 'Twas a coffin fit only for a giant, nearly finished but for one last gap in the coffin lid. The boy saw his fate in that gap. Yes, he knew then, as he was hammered into place, that it would be his unwilling duty to spend the rest of his days shielding old Sam Kelley from the earth above as the giant lay in his eternal slumber. That night, when the horned moon was highest in the sky, Sam Kelley hefted the coffin across one shoulder and set off down the mountain. The boy heard the crunch of logs beneath the behemoth's feet and the excitable chirping of the birdmen following closely behind. As dawn broke, the giant found a suitable spot, set down his casket, and fell to work with his shovel. Sam spent his last day above ground, digging a hole big enough to accommodate his bulk, eased the coffin into the chasm, gently placed his prized Peter LaFinch and a fat burlap sack into his shirt pocket, then climbed in, pulling the lid closed upon himself. Almost immediately, the boy felt the first shower of dry black earth strike his back. The birdmen above had begun to take turns filling in the grave. A chorus of reedy voices began to chant.
That far Sam Kelley came from the earth, and so must he return to the earth.
The thudding of earth on the coffin lid grew muffled and finally ceased. The grave was filled and the chanting could be heard no more. Yet for 2 long years Sam lay awake, gripping his left wrist lightly across his great belly. He stared into the boy's face as one would stare into the distance, as if the lad's eyes were nothing but knotholes in a pine board. Lay awake, waiting to die. It was said that the remaining birdmen went back to the maw of the cave, lit Terence the Torch's steadfast cap ablaze one last time, and hurled him headfirst like a matchstick into the giant's erstwhile abode. Terence flared against his peers, and the lot of them went up like so much kindling. A black, greasy smoke billowed from the cave mouth. The birds retreated from the searing heat as all of old Sam Kelley's worldly possessions were reduced to cinders. Having made good on their final obligation to their beloved Titan, they went off into the woods to roost as free men. At the end of the 2nd year, his time had finally come. With his last breath, never realizing he just wasted his last 2 virile years with this premature burial, old Sam Kelley had one last request for his feathered friend.
Sing me to sleep, Peter.
Then he died of natural causes. For 5 years they watched him rot. A glowing slime mold claimed his colossal corpse, giving off a pale green light. As the flesh slunk from his skeleton, the fungus shone ever more brightly, and as his whale bones were exposed, it was as if the plank folk were part and parcel of a gleaming subterranean cathedral. He stunk like a rat. As the seasons passed in the world above, tales were spread far and wide. The centuries-old shadow no longer loomed above the plains, for the giant was finally dead, and his fabled 500 was buried with him. And it was told that on a quiet day, you could just barely hear a soft singing from under the ground, a melodic low rumble, a shanty about the fallen giant and the fate of those buried with him. And for those who might dig on that spot, a fat bag of coins awaited. One cold, rainy night, about 20 years later, a band of desperate treasure hunters found the charred remains of a den. Naught was left but the occasional metal tooth and shoe buckle amongst the blackened bones. Nor was there any clue as to his final resting place. However, the discouraged bandits found hope in the remains, for the tall tale now seemed no taller than the man himself. There was no doubt the grave was near, and they would be the ones to find it, if only they could hear the singing from beneath the ground and through the heavy rain.
It's too dark to see.
I think we're lost.
Shut your trap, you big log.
I can hardly see me hand in front of me face.
quit your grousing.
Oh, what's that?
I can't see anything.
They slogged on through the soaked forest, their dripping cloaks pulled tight against the storm. For hours they pushed through brambles, scrambled up slippery banks, and fought their way out of deep, muddy suckholes. They persevered until the underbrush opened onto a broad, foggy meadow. It was in this merciful clearing that one of them heard a murmur through the slosh of their feet, and called the others to a halt. Behind the curtain of rain, a wavering hum persisted, growing now louder, now softer, as they followed it tirelessly like bloodhounds on the hunt. With each step they took, the hum grew beneath their feet until the mud rumbled with a tooth-rattling buzz of subterranean song. They wasted no time in plunging their spades into the sodden earth, and as they heaved clod after wet clod over their shoulders, a melody took shape. A chorus of hums lifted a piercing, sorrowful voice. A bird song.
Dig, lads, dig!
I could just taste those crisp Benjamins.
This is it, lads, the man of learn. Blasted rock.
I can hear them singing.
I were buried with Samme, Kelley, the plaint and the feather. No more to feel the mornings and the changes of the weather. We can hear the rain a-drumming upon the ground above us, but beneath the clay we're sure to stay. No giant left to love us. We're buried with some Kelley, planked and the feather. There's plenty of room within the tomb for birds and birds together, and the coffin full lie rigid as he rots away among us, all putrefying by the light, phosphorescent fungus, and the more it claims the corpus, the merrier it grows. While their tons of meat just whittled away on bones broke through his clothes, and I'm homesick for me birdcage I was perching in before. Now I live inside the rib cage where some Kelley breathes no more.
Spurred to action by the lovely dirge, the treasure hunters dug like men possessed, tossing up mud, stones, and roots. As one shovel struck a coffin plank, the voices within fell silent. The three bandits feverishly clawed the remaining soil from the lid and pried it loose, unleashing a stench that stung their eyes.
Oh, it stinks.
As the spores cleared, the giant's skeleton, draped in the tattered remnants of his garments, came into view, and peeking out of his ribcage like a distended belly, a promising bulge of burlap tied with twine. The overeager captain of the bandits hopped down into the coffin, grabbed hold of the plump sack, and pulled with all his might, but could not wrench it free. "He can't budge it," thought the boy from his lid on high. The brigand sputtered with frustrated greed and ordered his underlings to help him heave it free. "Heave on three, you groveling swabs!"
All right.
One, two, heave! With a cacophony of piercing squawks, their faces pounded by desperate wing beats, the three bandits were knocked back in a flurry of feathers. Flushed out from the chest cavity came Peter LaFinch, flapping upward in a panicked flight. As the bandits lay startled on the ground, watching as the Birdman clattered up and over the graveside, they shook their heads at their good fortune, having thought for sure they were done in by a cunning booby trap. As they regained their feet, the three slavered in anticipation. Oh, yeah. Then the captain, eyes agleam, tore open the sack. The color left the bandits' faces. Their stomachs dropped. The captain fell back, head in hands, as the lackeys clawed desperately through a massive sack of birdseed. But there was no gold to be found, just a lifetime supply of millet, pecked over cheekishly by LaFinch during his years in the cavernous hollow.
Mother of Christ!
The captain flew into a fit of rage, frustrated to fury by the false promise of riches. With nary a thought for the consequences, he hurled down his shovel and snapped one of the planks underfoot, setting off a chain reaction that buckled the floor, then the walls, sending plank folk ricocheting off walls and floors alike, setting off their comrades' spines in turn, in a series of loud cracks that vibrated the earthen walls at a fever pitch, triggering a mudslide and collapsing the giant's tomb in upon itself. Bandit lungs filled with cold mud, and all the planks lay snapped and smothered, the wrecked bodies of thieves and flat folk entangled beneath tons of sopping mud. Shifting tectonic plates consumed the grave and dragged the lot of them to hell. Peter LaFinch scrambled over the sinking surface, fighting to keep his footing. Just when he thought he'd found solid ground, the earth beneath him gave way. With a desperate flap of his wings, he lunged toward the sopping cliff edge, and his fingers found purchase on a rigid object rising from the loamy soil, perhaps a sapling. He clung to that post for dear life, and eventually the earth ceased to shudder, and he pulled himself up, shaking his sodden feathers and kissing the ground. Only then did he notice that the life-saving post had two buckled shoes pointed skyward, soiled pantaloons, a rotten little tunic, and as he dislodged it from the earth, the head and accompanying face of a rosy-cheeked boy. There was fear in the blue eyes as they darted about, and Peter realized he owed his life to this boy, hurled clear of the implosion by blind fate. The Birdman, now obligated to repay the debt, decided to nurse the boy back to health. Peter LaFinch threw the rigid little body over one shoulder and carried him high into the largest pine, fed him by regurgitating worms, and relaxed and softened his muscles by roosting on him to keep him warm. Long months of care paid off as life returned to the boy's atrophied limbs, and soon Peter urged him to leave the nest.
Why?
The newly softened fledgling wasn't sure of himself, and pleaded with his avian masseuse. "Just a few days longer, me lord. I'm really not sure I know how to fly."
Why?
Maybe I just will for myself then.
The lad was spurred to a new confidence by the urgings of his mentor. In that moment he felt more man than boy, and more bird than man. He struggled to rise. His legs were still brittle from his years as a plank, as weak and wobbly as those of a newborn foal. He took his first tremulous step since being handled by the giant, off into the cool winter air, and plummeted 20 feet to the unforgiving forest floor without even the time to attempt a flap. His legs crunched beneath him, still rigid enough to curl in upon themselves like birch bark from the brunt of the fall. Electrifying pain shot through his ruined limbs. He cried and pissed his pants.
Oh God, such pain, oh dearie me, oh my, oh, now I'm truly battered and broken.
For you see, his still brittle young body struck the earth with such devastating force that he conked himself Irish. As he began to faint from the pain, he saw Peter LaFinch flutter away into the distance, his debt repaid, his costume illuminated by the orange glow of the late afternoon sun. Then he disappeared beyond the pines, flapping with such grace that it looked almost as if he might take flight. A beautiful creature. As for the boy, he weathered the winter upon the forest floor, dragging himself forward each day such as he could manage. He found grubs and vermin to his taste, having grown accustomed to them under the tutelage of Peter's plumage. But now, chewing for himself for the first time since his snappening, he found the crunch of beetles especially satisfying. Eventually, the lad made it back into town. In fact, he made it back to this very house, into this very bonus room, held fast by a great big lock. And for ages now, he's sat in this very chair, reciting this very tale to any traveler, or indeed, any passing bird that'll listen. As a snapling, I learned the difficult truth. Giants are real. Be afraid. Stray not into the great pine forest, lest your body be snapped by an immense man, kept in a tool shed for ages until he buries himself alive, and you're left to watch him rot until you're dug up by treasure hunters, thrown loose from a calamitous cave-in to be nursed back to health by a man with feathers glued to his fucking head, deceived into thinking you can fly when he himself clearly can't, then leaping from the nest to snap your legs until they're as curled and laughable as elven shoes, then condemned to drag yourself through the snow over the course of 4 bloody-knuckled months, only to be greeted by the mocking laughter of the village children, wheeled about in a barrow as a curiosity. Short pants, they called me, and they get so cold you have to keep them under a blanket all day for the rest of your goddamn gaze upon them. God, gnarled little shrimp tails, a constant curly reminder of the wages of greed. You shake your head in pity. No, 'tis too late for your tears, for I chose my path. I forged my chains. I wound the spring that coiled my corpus. That's right, for I was the boy. So remember ye well the moral of my tale. Don't be greedy or you'll walk no more. Have a care lest you become home decor. Giants are real. Do not trespass upon their land. But if you must, at least take 2 friends. Anything less than travelers 3 and you'll end up snapped like the thief and me. You'll be dipping your toes in your concave knees. I tell you, there's no hope for you if you go after that treasure. Forget it. 500 in cash is a handsome ransom, but there'll be no chance for you to find it. It went down with that cave, burnt black from Terrence the Torch, right down to the very bowels. It's buried under tons of ash and planks and rubble. You'd be a fool to seek it intact. Nothing could have survived that inferno. Nothing, you hear? Save for the pipe snake crew, suspended miles beneath the cave in the baked amber jelly that clogs those pipes. I still hear the hum of me coffin mates. Curse that haunting hum. I cut my fucking legs off. It's the thing that everyone says, and nobody does it. Will not be. Be 5 foot fucking. Anyone taller than 6 foot, don't you be put on the list. You hear?